There are certain chess openings which are termed defences, when in fact a more accurate term would really be counter-attack, because black isn't just seeking to neutralise the white initiative, he wants to get some play for himself too. One of these is the subject of this video. It's called the Budapest defence and arises after that gambit there, 2e5. It can be a pure gambit, and very often black gets the pawn back for good attacking chances and active play. Not always, it's not guaranteed to regain it, but there is pretty good compensation as a rule. The first thing to say about the theory of this opening is that the only critical lines arise if white accepts the gambit. Declining with something like 3 knight to f3 or 3e3 poses no problem whatsoever for black. He can just take on d4, for example, in either case. Pushing by with 3d5 presents the nicest square you could imagine for the black king bishop with 3 bishop to c5, when black is already at least equal. And so white takes the pawn on e5 and black responds with knight to g4. The alternative knight to e4 is called the Fajarowicz gambit, but in my opinion is clearly inferior to knight g4. First of all then, we'll be looking at ways the white can rather unwisely try to hang on to the pawn with moves like f4, queen d5, or queen d4, all of which are not recommended. He will lose a great deal of time and or weaken himself in the process whilst hanging on to his extra pawn. Then there are the ways in which white chooses to return the pawn, starting with e4, after which I'm confident of black's position after knight takes e5. Most games from here have continued with f4, and then knight from e5 to c6 is my preferred choice. Then we'll be looking at some treatments for white which have become quite popular of late, involving concentration on the outpost at d5 for one of his knights. One of these is to start with the extraordinary looking move knight h3, from where the knight will be going to f4 and to d5. Another way for white to head for a similar sort of middle game is to start with e3 after knight takes e5. Then there are a variety of ways of angling a knight toward the d5 square, including of course knight h3 in this position. Against most, if not all, of these strategies, I'm going to advocate a setup with g6 and bishop g7, kingside fianchetto for black. This will prove a particularly effective strategy in the lines where black is unlikely to be overrun in the centre of the board. Next we're looking at lines where white, having defended his pawn with knight f3, black responds knight c6, then chooses to hang on for it for the time being with bishop to f4, one of the more common treatments. Here I recommend giving the check for the bishop to b4. The alternative is bishop to c5, a respected line, but in my opinion this is the better of the two. We'll be seeing first of all white playing knight to c3 here, after which black has to gambit. There's no way to regain the Budapest pawn. But following check, the recapture, queen e7, queen d5 does indeed hang on to the e5 pawn. But f6, pawn takes f6, knight takes f6. Lead us into a situation well charted in Grandmaster theory, but we've seen an interesting new idea from the 1996 New York Open, played by Czech Grandmaster Pavel Blatný. After knight d2, the more common move, queen e7, leads to a comfortable equality. Once again we'll be seeing a game of Pavel Blatny's, showing how to handle that with black. And finally, in the line with knight f3, knight c6, e3, one of the main lines, I shall be advocating a treatment involving, once again, kingside fianchetto, starting with knight from g4 takes e5. It's not the usual way they play it, but in my opinion it's unfairly neglected. For example, after bishop e2, g6, and bishop g7 to follow, which I think leads to interesting and dynamic play for black. Well, the first thing to say is that having taken the pawn, you don't want to hang on to it with a move like f4, Because it's too greedy, it's too weakening, black responds with bishop to c5. And there's already a classical type of compensation, similar to some lines perhaps of the King's Gambit or even of Fromm's Gambit. Threat now is knight to f2, forking, so knight to h3 to protect. And after d6, black is getting splendid play for his gambited pawn. Consider, for example, pawn takes on d6, otherwise black will win the pawn back. Recapture with a c-pawn. White plays e4, trying to get his development going. Black castles. Develop the queen's knight to c3. Rook to the open e-file. And black has very good play indeed for the pawn, with moves like queen to h4 check and knight to c6 coming in, and white's still unable to castle. Two other methods of hanging on to the pawn, which theory doesn't recommend for white, involve early movement of the queen. As you well know, it's not supposed to move the queen too early on in the opening, because the opponent will gain time very probably by kicking it around. That's what happens to either queen d4 or queen d5. If we look at the second of those two options, first of all, queen to d5. Black then just keeps developing with knight c6, and already the sort of classical compensation for a pawn will become apparent. For example, if f4, which was a bad move last time, it's still a bad move here as well, theory suggests something like, for example, knight b4, and then it will be other moves as well, queen to e4, bishop to c5, threatening the same fork on f2 we saw a moment ago, knight h3 to defend it, black castles, and with moves like f7 to f5, or d7 to d6, get very good play for the gambited pawn. So since f4 is so weakening, a better way of hanging on to the pawn for the time being is knight f3. Now black should really gambit d6, foregoing once and for all any opportunity to get back the pawn on e5. But the compensation he gets is pretty good. For example, if bishop to g5, bishop to e7, take on e7, take back with a knight. Quite a cute idea, because white can't keep the extra pawn now. If queen e4, pawn takes e5, intending f5 next move. Or in fact there's a rather more sinister threat in the position, because if white now plays knight takes e5, or h3, kicking the knight, or this move, knight takes e5, then the black queen goes all the way down to d1 with check. Only one move for white, king takes d1, of course the fork on f2 means black will regain all the material and have the better pawn structure and the better game. Alternatively, if white takes on d6, going to move his bishop to e6. We're in clearly gambit territory now. But whatever white does, black gets pretty hot play for the pawn. For example, taking on c7, attacking the opponent's queen. Well, one good move is queen takes c7. And after the white queen moves, perhaps all the way back to base, give check on b4, follow up with rook d8, or even castle queenside if you can. White retreats immediately with queen back to d1. Black would of course develop and capture a pawn with bishop takes d6. And already his lead in development is apparent. He has the sneaky threat of knight takes f2, exploiting the white lag, for if then king takes f2, bishop to g3 check is a discovered attack which would win the white queen. Finally, if white returns one of his pawns with d7 check, black takes it off, bishop takes d7, and has again good compensation. Perhaps bishop to b4 check to speed up his development, enable him to castle with a gain of tempo, or maybe even the knight coming into b4 when white has problems covering some of the sensitive squares like c2. Both of these ideas give an indication of the kind of gambit play black has. Therefore, somebody once suggested the move a3 here, not a developing move, more of a defensive one, to shut black down a bit. But the best reply, I think, is queen to f6, intending perhaps to castle queenside very quickly. won't give any more concrete analysis than that, because this is the sort of flavour of compensation, of play, that the Budapest practitioners should be hoping to get. By the same token, queen to d4 is also a bit unwise because of the loss of time coming. Black plays d6, pure gambit, and after pawn takes on d6, you can recapture straight away with the bishop. One point being that white cannot gorge himself further with queen takes g7 because of bishop to e5, with an immediate win for black, because the only square is queen to g5. Black simply exchanges queens, and then we'll win a rook in the corner. After bishop takes g5, bishop takes b2. Also, the attempt to be a bit disruptive with queen to e4 check is not such a problem for black. After bishop e6, constructive developing move, white could then grab the other knight's pawn with queen takes b7. But by so doing, exposes himself, after the forced reply knight to d7, to a massive development lag, which is likely to cause him quite a few headaches. There was even one game between a computer and an unspecified opponent, I believe, which from here went e3, black castled, knight to f3, knight to c5, attacking the queen, queen to b5, and after rook b8, the penalty of grabbing those ill-gotten gains becomes apparent. If queen to c6, the queen is trapped with rook b6. Or if queen to a5, then knight to d3 check is terminal, for if bishop takes d3, there comes bishop to b4 check, winning the queen a different way. Or if white doesn't take this knight off, as you can imagine, its intrusion is going to be a serious problem. King d1 to protect the bishop would allow an immediate and winning fork on f2. A less greedy move, getting on with developing, is knight f3, but after castles, things are already tough for white. If, for example, knight to c3, then just keeping on developing with knight c6, queen back to, say, d1, bishop c5, places white in almost insuperable difficulties, even with the offer of a queen exchange. If now e3, then exchanging the queens, queen takes d1 check, white must obviously recapture with the knight, and then knight to b4, and the problem of the projected fork on c2 makes black's position virtually winning already. Well, so patent is black's compensation for his pawn here that I'm only aware of one practical example from this position. That was in 1933, a Hungarian game where white tried to kick the knight with h3. But as you imagine, if such a natural move as knight c3, as we just saw, results in a virtually lost position even after an exchange of queens, then white must be in a pretty bad way. It didn't last long. Black played knight c6. And there's a familiar theme of queen d1, which you'll probably spot, which is that the combination with knight takes f2, which we saw earlier on. After king takes f2, bishop to g3 check, running the white queen in her bed. So he tried queen e4, but that just meant a further gain of time after rook e8. Queen c2. Black now has several forced wins. Knight b4 he played. And white played queen c3. Well, black can now force a win probably with bishop to f5. When the threat of knight to c2 check and a discovered attack is decisive. Another way would be to play knight to d3 check, remarkably enough. Because if white takes it with the queen, if he doesn't, obviously he's dead meat. Black then plays bishop to b4 check, threatening to play queen takes queen, and the white pawn on e2 is pinned. Therefore, the only way to avoid that loss of the queen is to go king d1. But then, as you can see, you lose it another way because of knight takes f2 check. Of course, in the position after 5 bishop takes d6, black is threatening to win the white queen with bishop to b4. Check, discovering an attack. Well, as mentioned, queen e4 check, bishop e6 is quite acceptable from black's point of view. There was one more recent game than 1933 in this line with 4 queen d4, which was between, amazingly enough, Alexander Beliavsky and Vladimir Epishin at the tournament in Reggio Emilia in Italy in 1991. A very strong tournament. Beliavsky, former champion of the Soviet Union, former world junior champion, former candidate for the world championship. Not the sort of man you're accustomed to seeing playing in this game. He preferred not to grab the pawn on b7, but developed a piece with knight c3. But after castles, the loss of time he experiences because of the precocious development of the queen told against him. He kept developing, knight f3, so did the Epishin, queen d7. Now, I'm not quite sure what was going on in Alexander's head this day. He came up with knight d4, which has the virtue, I suppose, of returning the pawn to gain the 2 bishops. Epishin took the offered pawn on c4. He now has material equality. Beliavsky's idea was to play knight to f5, attacking both minor pieces on the 4th rank. But black had an entirely adequate reply, and bishop back to e6. Because if white takes his knight on g4, black takes the white knight on f5. So Beliavsky kept going with knight takes d6. This is the game of the bishop pair. But Epishin correctly took back with a pawn, giving herself an isolated queen's pawn, but this is one of those occasions where it's more of a dynamic asset than a weakness. White must get developed. He played g3. Black kept on gaining time, hitting that queen, d5. Queen to f4, d4. Knight to e4. It's a game of splendid dynamism from Epishin. Bishop d5. The idea being, of course, to follow up with f7 to f5, pinning the knight against the rook in the corner. That tactic would be effective even if white were to now fianchetto with bishop from f1 to g2. So he therefore did something else. Played f3. But the whole position is about initiative. Black didn't pause for a moment when f7 to f5 he still carried on with. Knight to c5, getting it off prees with gain of tempo. But queen e7 was a very good move. If now white had taken on d4, black would reply with rook d8 with a splendid initiative. So Beliavsky played knight to d3, trying to get his act together desperately. But after knight to c6, developing and protecting the pawn on d4, Epishin found a splendid way of developing actively, and still that knight on g4 hasn't moved despite the long-term seeming attack on it. Well, Beliavsky initiated a real attack by playing h2 to h3, threatening to take it with the other pawn. This time black moved it, of course. Knight from g4 to e5, threatening to win the queen with knight takes d3 check. Beliavsky took it. Black took back with the knight. And of course there's no material lag for black either. He isn't even as much as one pawn down for this big initiative. He's threatening to win now with knight to d3 check, forking the king and queen, or also to take on f3 with either bishop or knight. So, the sorry sight of a super grandmaster moving his king with 0 development so early on in the game. Probably several ways keeping an advantage here with black, perhaps putting a rook on the d file or the c file. But he played the most ambitious one, d3. Which if white captures will allow the capture on f3, which is very disruptive. So Beliavsky developed a piece of bishop d2. And Epishin took on e2. White took back. And now comes another dynamic tactic. He took on f3 with a bishop. The point being, if white takes that with bishop takes f3, then of course there comes knight to d3 check, forking king and queen. Beliavsky tried some resistance with bishop to b4. The attacking potential, though, of black's position became really apparent after queen to e6. Had white now grabbed the rook on f8, I think black should not have been content to just take back on h1 himself, but should rather play the more attacking move, bishop takes e2. Temporarily the exchange down for one pawn, but if white were to take the bishop back, the body count reveals that he now has an extra rook. The move queen a6 check is a decisive initiative, I'm sure. First of all, if white now plays the king to f2 or e1, in either case the fork on d3 with check wins his queen. If he goes with his king to d1, then rook d8 check is pretty much decisive. So Alexander struggled on gamely with rook from h1 to e1, but after bishop takes e2, the big fork on d3 is still there, and things are looking terminal. He tried the strange move queen e3, hoping perhaps to take the knight on e5 after the bishop moves, but Epichin wrapped things up with pawn to f4, opening up the f5 with a decisive attack against the white king. And Belyavsky had seen enough and he resigned in this position. After a mere 25 moves, one of the best players in the world utterly routed by the Budapest Gambit. 4 e2 to e4 is a popular enough method of giving the pawn back. The black knight is attacked. There are some gambit lines with d6 and stuff, but knight takes e5 is certainly the most reputable move. Now, if unchallenged, black will just carry on developing happily. For example, if bishop to e2, then after bishop to c5, and a subsequent d7 to d6, he's unlikely to be too troubled. So, the most critical line arises after 5f4. Of the two available squares for the black knight, I don't like g6 so much. Later on he might get kicked with f4 to f5. So we're going to be looking at the position after knight e5 to c6. In 1994, this position occurred in a game between two of the world's stronger grandmasters, Dortov and Van Vliet. And white chose the move a3, which is designed to have a cramping effect. And also, if black now plays the move we've been talking about, bishop c5, taking advantage of this nice open diagonal, it's something of a trap because white replies with b4. And should black now take on g1, until white recaptures, black can win a pawn with queen h4 check. But the problem is that after g3, queen takes h2, rook g2 for example, queen h6, knight to c3, white with his bishop pair, and also in view of the somewhat displaced black queen, has very good compensation indeed for the gambited pawn. Therefore, after 6a3, most black players have done what Van Vliet did and just replied with a5. After the interpolation of these two a-pawn moves, normal service is resumed. White plays bishop e3, stopping for the time being black's occupation of c5 that way. The black reply is engineered towards playing bishop c5, it's knight to a6. Support for the c5 square. And if white now plays queen to d5, rather an ugly looking move, trying to stop the bishop coming to c5, well, the natural move b6 prepares the fianchetto of the black queen's bishop and also to play bishop c5. So Dortov developed with knight c3, and they came the projected bishop c5. Queen d2 to develop and protect that piece, and d6. Dortov wished to avoid, after this natural move knight f3, black playing the equal natural bishop g4. So, in order to try and make the black development more difficult, more complicated, he played first of all bishop d3. We're taught to develop knights before bishops. This was designed to make matters a little less easy for black to achieve development comfortably. Now came a very interesting idea from Van Vliet. He played the disruptive check, queen to h4, an idea we should be seeing again in some of these lines. White played g3, and he dropped the queen back to h5, the idea being just to try to complicate white's development of his king side. So Dortov, in his search for an advantage, played the strange looking move king to f2. Black castled. Now white played knight to f3. Had he played knight to e2, it would have met with the same reply. Bishop g4. Threatening to win a piece, so of course white dropped back with his bishop. Black developed his king's rook. And now h3 from white virtually forces the following exchanging operation. Bishop takes knight on f3. Bishop takes bishop. Now black, first glance, looks like his queen is in trouble, but he finds a way of getting the necessary squares with tempo. Bishop takes e3 check. Queen takes e3. And of course the queen swings across to c5, incidentally attacking the pawn on c4. Dortov exchanged the queens, and we reach after knight takes c5 in reply, a sort of equal queenless middle game. White played rook d1 to avoid the check on d3. Black fixed the queen side with a4. And now something of a dance ensued to end the game. Knight to d5. Knight came back to a6 to protect c7. Knight c3, taking a4. Knight c5. Knight back to d5. Knight to a6. Knight to c3. And a truce was agreed. So that's an example of black maximising his chances and demonstrating a good and clever equality. Well, some sort of measures against black playing bishop c5 are usually taken, either a3 as we just saw, or bishop e3, which we'll be seeing. Before coming to that though, there was a game from 1978 between Rafael Vaganyan, accomplished world-class master, and Tom Vedberg of Sweden, who was very ingenious and playing very well around those times, but never in fact rose to GM level. Vaganyan played knight f3, this is at the Buenos Aires Olympiad of 1978, and Vedberg took diagonal, thank you very much, with bishop c5. Knight c3, d6, the same small centre as it's called for black, with the bishop well developed. Bishop d3 played white, and there came a5, a sort of multi-purpose move. It's controlling b4, looking after the safety of the bishop so that if it's attacked with knight a4 it's somewhere to drop back to. And Vaganyan chose a probably too optimistic plan of h3 to stop the bishop going to g4. Knight a6, knight d5, again not exactly playing by the rules, is he, moving developed pieces twice. Bishop e6. And one thing to note now, a recurrent theme over the next 2 or 3 moves, is if white plays bishop e3, black doesn't take it, it takes the knight on d5. Now attacking the bishop on e3. And if white then captures on c5, black throws in the impolite move bishop takes e4, a desperado of the bishop on e4. And only next move will he take back on c5 with a knight and be a good clear pawn up. Rafael Vaganyan made another slightly esoteric choice. He played a3. Doesn't develop anything, but keeps a piece out of b4, I suppose. Black castle. And the question is, precisely how should white get castle? Once again, the bishop e3 isn't possible because of the trick we just saw last move, bishop takes d5. So to try and help things along, he went f5, forcing a crisis. Of course, black took on d5. Took back with the c pawn. Black played knight to e5, and you can see just how wonderful a piece that bishop on c5 is, stopping the white king from castling. Vaganyan played another somewhat dubious move, knight takes e5. Of course black threw in the check, queen h4, king d2, only now did he recapture. And with the white king migrating around a bit, and white also a bit behind in development, the consequences of the opening have been very good indeed for black. The alternative at move 6, bishop to e3, a straightforward way of stopping black playing bishop c5 for the time being. The most commonly seen move here has been bishop to b4 check. Well, there's a variety of ways of getting out of that check. First of all, knight to d2. And here the theoretically recommended move is a disruptive check once again. Queen to h4. g3, and only now queen to e7. The argument is that the slight softening up is to black's advantage in preference to the immediate. Queen e7. There aren't many practical examples from here. A game between Poe Martin, the late Wolfgang Heidenfeld, from Holland 1963, went bishop g2, a5, again this familiar queenside development for black, knight e2, knight to a6, castles. Black could now consider the bishop to c5. Instead he played d6. Knight to b3. Bishop out to g4. h3 to challenge it. Took off on e2. Queen takes e2, and of course the idea is to fight for these dark squares, so a5 to a4. To be followed by bishop to c5. With knight d4, for example, knight takes d4, bishop recaptures, then bishop to c5 with equality. In the game 4 years later, Vizier O'Kelly from Malaga, 1967, tried a different plan, queen f3, trying to castle queenside. Black did okay after knight a6. Castles queenside, knight c5, attacking the e-pawn, so white took it off. I must say, giving up the bishop like that strikes me as a very unlikely method indeed of emerging from the opening with an advantage, and indeed it didn't. Black took back with the bishop, knight b3, d6, knight e2, that kind of very interesting move, f5. White took the bishop on c5, black recaptured, increasing his central control of the square d4, for example. White played e5, black castle. His idea now will be to play bishop to e6, then rook to the d file to contest the square d4, and he can look to the future with confidence. One lesser trodden path after 7 knight d2 occurred in the game Restas Panchenko from Budapest in 1990, a fitting enough venue for this game. Black passed over the immediate check on h4 and played instead just d6. The game saw some quite original tactical ideas. White played the innocent enough move bishop d3. Now came queen h4 check, g3, queen f6. The game went queen c2, knight a6, now a very casual natural move, knight to e2. But after bishop c5, things are looking a bit tricky for white because of tactics involving the black knights. For example, if now bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, knight b4 is threatened, but if white tries to stop it with a3, there comes the very impolite move queen takes b2, winning a clear pawn. Well, probably in view of that, white lashed out with some strange tactics, beginning with e5, after pawn takes e5, knight e4, queen e7. It wasn't really working for him, and black went on to win in 30 moves. Most straightforward way of getting out of that check is knight c3, something of a main line. One of the more recent games to reach this position at Grandmaster level was between Cvitan and Rogers in Rusac, Yugoslavia in 1987, where Rogers played what I think was a new move, strangely enough, just taking the knight off with check. The idea certainly isn't new, almost mandatory in fact, but hadn't really been seen so much in that particular position. We'll come back and look at it later on, another way of playing it. White has played Queen e7, and you can already see we have a totally imbalanced situation out of the opening. White has a bishop pair, but his queenside pawns have been mangled. Black hopes to make some progress because of his better pawn structure and more solid game. Bishop d3. Natural developing move. And knight a6. By now you're getting used to that piece going to that square. Knight e2, played Svitan. And knight c5. He could just have played b6 there if he wanted to, but he chose to sharpen things up immediately. Svitan gambited the e-pawn by castling. Indeed, it'd be very difficult for Black to get away with grabbing it, since he's so far behind development. So he preferred a developing move b6. Knight g3. Holding an unwelcome visitor at f5, so g6 stops it. Bishop d4. It's again a clear threat to the rook in the corner. Of course, Black didn't want to undouble those pawns, so let's play rook g8. e4 to e5. So Rogers carried on developing, bishop to b7. And Svitan kept the pressure on with knight e4. This time the knight would make an unwelcome guess at f6 if allowed, so Ian Rogers took it off. Svitan recaptured. Very dangerous attacking player, Svitan, former world junior champion. And Black castled queenside, an almost mandatory development given the pawn structure. White played the aggressive move Queen d1 to a4 with visions of attack, and it was a very complicated struggle which eventually drawn in 47 moves. But the point I want to make is that Black could have done even better than this. If we go back 50 years before that game to Prague, game Keres versus Gilk, Black threw in 7 Queen to h4 check, g3 in reply, and only now did he take the knight. So exactly the same position, but White's played g2, g3. Again, in development, you might think again of time, well, really more of a softening up of the diagonal. Bishop to d3, knight to a6. Keres went bishop c2, this time to hang on to his d-pawn. Same sort of moves, b6. Knight f3, knight to c5, and White castled. The point being that the e-pawn can't really be taken. For example, if knight takes e4, maybe bishop takes e4, there are probably other ways of refuting it. Queen takes e4, and bishop takes b6 will cause some problems because of the threat of rook e1, winning the queen. So, Mr. Guild carried on. Regardless, bishop b7, e5, castles queenside. A familiar enough setting, the black pieces on the same sorts of squares. I played knight d4, but a noticeable softening up of the long diagonal. Probably now best was something like g7 to g6, again keeping the knight out of f5, a similar theme we saw in the game between Svitan and Rogers. It's quite a complicated situation, but Black certainly is no worse. That's a brief overview of the play after e2, e4, and Black taking back with a knight on e5. Plenty of active play, often a struggle for the a7 to g1 diagonal, the Black bishop going to c5, good active chances, and in quite a few lines White getting doubled pawns, which gave Black good targets to play against in the middle games. One treatment for White against Budapest that's become more popular over the past couple of decades is just giving the pawn back and centering upon the square d5 as an outpost for a white knight, most probably the queen's knight, sometime the king's. And you can begin that process of aiming for such a middle game with even so unlikely looking a move as knight h3, in preference to knight to f3, because we're going to f4, and then to have influence on, if not actual occupation of, d5. Another way, if we move the knight back, to set up the same idea is to start off with 4e3. Attacking the knight, of course Black will take the pawn, and then the same sort of idea, knight to h3, aiming at f4 and d5. And the question arises, how is black going to get his men off the back rank? Well, we've seen bishops going to c5, we've seen them going to b4. Interesting idea from the Grandmaster Jonathan Tisdall, not quite certain what nationality to give him. He lives in Oslo now, married to an Oswegian lady, but he's in sort of Sino-American Irish in his time. Jonathan Tisdall, anyway, playing black against Mikhail Gurevich in a tournament in Iceland in 1988, decided to fianchetto with g6. Game knight to f4, bishop g7. But also this completed development, bishop to e2, both sides castle, and after 8, d6, the stage is set for the middle game. Some surround his with a King's Indian defence from black's point of view, rather unusual posting of the white knight in f4, but white does have rather more space. Knight c3, queen's knight to d7, queen c2, a5. Not strictly forced, but all very much in this kind of King's Indian mode, securing the square c5. This time, not as we've been accustomed to seeing in this video, most often for a bishop, but for a knight. Bishop to d2, knight c5, rook a d1, and now black chose the most active continuation of f5. Chances here, this middle game probably about equal. In the event, black forced resignation at move 38. Personally, I think that plan of black kingside fianchetto is one of the best ways to respond to these treatments of e3 or knight h3. Earlier in 1997, Garry Kasparov took on some European amateurs in consultation, and with white he now played e3. It's one recommendation for the system, isn't it, when he's playing it? Knight takes on e5, and now knight c3. So it's this time the most natural knight to eye up square d5. Well, here g6 is certainly to be considered, as is bishop b4. The amateurs played knight c6, came a3, familiar cramping idea. And one of the problems of the move knight c6, if you play g6 now, after f4, it's bye-bye knight. Well, in view of that, as I say, I don't like knight c6 so much. I think I'd probably play a5 here myself and try and put the bishop on c5. The amateurs in consultation played bishop e7, and after f4, interesting treatment by the world champion, knight must go to the rather sad square g6. He then followed up with g3. As you can see, after d6, bishop g2, bishop e6, what I've been harking on about, came to pass as the knight landed on d5. The consequences of this opening are pretty unsatisfactory for black. Both his king's knight and king bishop are rather badly placed. However, the team did manage to draw with what many people, including myself, regard as the best player ever in 37 moves. We've seen that when white in this system rapidly transfers his king's knight, often via h3, to f4, black is given the opportunity to fianchetto his king's bishop. In principle, this is one of the satisfactory, and maybe even the very best, points of development for it in this particular situation. The chance of being overrun in the centre rapidly with e4, f4 ideas hitting the king's knight at e5 is very unlikely with the white knight already on f4. It's still a rather undeveloped, theoretically unexplored idea, but in this particular setting I think it actually is quite a good idea in the Budapest. The most popular response for white against the Budapest Gambit involves first of all capturing, as we see, and then defending the new pawn on e5 with bishop to f4. A logical developing move. After knight c6, knight to f3, bishop to b4 check. Of the two interpolations with the knight we'll start off with knight c3, which is the sharper of the two, because now we really do have a gambit. There's no consistent way for black to get the pawn back. He will search for his compensation, however, for the gambited pawn in the following way. Bishop takes knight check. We capture queen e7. And now, an ugly move, queen d5. These white are pawn up and about to play h3 with a decisive advantage. So black has no choice. f6. Same applies for white. Take the pawn, otherwise black will just recapture on e5 with a perfectly good game. Knight takes f6. Well, the attack queen usually drops back to d3. Were it to go back to d2, for example, that would be inviting a later knight to e4 with tempo at some stage. So that's to be avoided. Queen d3. And then d6. Not only to develop, but also to take away the threat of bishop takes c7. Now from here, white should almost certainly fianchetto the king's bishop. You might think that e3 is a natural enough move, for example, but it can lead to big headaches. Consider this game from the tournament in Pula in 1990 between Niksevic and Gavric. e3 looks innocent enough, as we say. Black castles. Bishop e2. What's the problem, you might think? Well, just see. In comes the knight to the juicy e4 square. White castles. Black plays bishop f5, already threatening winning discoveries like knight takes f2. So white took evasive action. Queen d5 check. King h8. And now c3 is hanging to the knight. So rook c1 to defend it. And black just keeps on keeping on. g5. Only one move. Bishop g3. h5. Now a move of the h pawn would be disastrous. Something like h3 would allow knight takes bishop on g3. The white recaptures. Queen takes e3 check, and the bishop on e2 hangs. Rook f2, in reply to defend it, would allow the capture of the rook on c1. So Mr. Niksevic sought complications with knight d4. But black just dropped back with bishop g6, reinstoring the threat of h4, trapping that bishop. And white is still in a bit of a pickle. He took the knight on c6. Black recaptured, still threatening h4, trapping the bishop. So queen d4 check was played. King h7, still threatening the bishop trap. And bishop d3. There is a way out for that bishop, as you'll see. c5, black started off with, only one square for the queen. Queen e5, h4, and now white produces the same desperate defensive hope that he would have deployed last move had black played h4 immediately before c5, but f3. So the counterattack on e4 lets the bishop out, but it's not all over yet. Knight takes g3, bishop takes g6 check, king takes g6. And now does white recapture the piece. And black takes his chances. Queen takes e3 check, king h2, h takes g3 check, king takes g3. Well, the white king is a bit unhappy. Black played rook e8 and should really, I think, have gone on to win from here. But in fact, white scrambled out with a draw at move 56. But the thing I want you to note is the way that black's moves are very simple. Knight e4, bishop f5, g5, h5. The most obvious, simple ideas you can think of. He just kept keeping on, and rolled white up on the king's side, so only the most desperate defensive measures gave white a hope of saving the game, and even then he shouldn't have succeeded in doing so. So that is a cautionary tale, what happens if white plays 11 e3. So, safer to put the bishop on the long diagonal, g3, black castles. Bishop g2. Well, white's assets are the bishop pair, and the extra pawn, black has a solid position, and the pawn he's down is a doubled, isolated one. Still, white had been scoring rather well from this position until an interesting new idea was introduced in 1996, the New York Open, by Pavel Blatný of the Czech Republic in his game as black against Luc van Vili. And he played knight a5. A lot of previous games had seen moves like bishop d7, knight e4. White had often countered by bringing his own knight to d4 and getting active play. Already, it's a position of some theoretical importance. Critical would be an appropriate word, I think. White castled, but had he played knight d4, for example, black should sight on that weak c-pawn with queen f7. If white does nothing, black's just going to take it with either knight or queen. And the variations after rook b1, where he's trying to get some compensation in terms of activity along the long diagonal from g2, and also the file b1 against b7, lead to lines like knight takes c4, and if bishop now takes on b7, black recaptures, rook takes b7, and then comes the unlikely looking move queen d5. Black is not only threatening to capture a rook, he's actually threatening mate on h1. The only move to cover both the rooks is queen f3. Then with just rook b8, it's yet another situation of active play compensating for a pawn minus for black, in this case rather probably overcompensating for it. So for example, if white exchanges rooks on b8 after black recaptures, he is once again threatening checkmate, this time rook down to b1. And if white castles, then the endings we're getting after queen takes f3, pawn takes f3, or knight takes knight d5 are very rosy indeed for black. In principle, we can analyse quite a few variations here, but what's tending to happen after the earlier move rook b8 is that black's activity fully compensates, as I say, overcompensates for the pawn. And for this reason, that long line of analysis stemming from the simple forced idea of knight d4 did not occur. Luc van Vili is one of the strongest Dutch players, and he instead played a different move if we go back to the position after black's novelty at move 12, knight a5. So white castled instead. Black, naturally enough, developed the bishop with tempo. Only one move to defend the attack c4 pawn is knight d2. And Blatný carried on with his interesting idea with knight d7. And Van Vili played a very interesting move, he played knight b3. The immediate point is that bishop takes c4, loses to bishop d5 check, followed by the capture of the knight at a5. And if knight takes on c4, then white will capture the pawn on b7, staying a pawn up with a better game. Therefore, Blatný came back. Knight to c6. And the pressure continues. This time the knight's threatening to pop up d5, and from there take the pawn at c4. Or just put general pressure on it. Knight d4. Came Van Vili. Reply, knight from c6 to e5. Certainly putting in the legwork, these knights. Queen e3. Finally the c-pawn falls, bishop takes c4, and white gets the b pawn as compensation. If he didn't, he'd probably be worse because of the pawn structure. Black plays rook a e8. In a sense, this is almost the end of the beginning here. We didn't get, as maybe Blatný best hoped, a favourable interchange on the queen side. What happened was that the weakling at c4 was exchanged off for a relatively healthy pawn at b7. But in compensation, black has got pretty active piece play, and this probably suffices to hold the balance. White had to organise somehow. He went queen d2. Black shifted his own queen onto a light square, queen f7. The bishop at b7 looks a bit out of it, so Van Vili brought it back. g2. A harassing move now from Blatný, knight g6, threatening the bishop, which moved back to e3, and now knight to f6. It's reasonable play for a pawn. In the event, Van Vliet played knight c6, and Blackney responded with a natural enough move, knight e4, aggressive, hitting the white queen. But in retrospect, probably a better try was bishop d5, the significance of it being that it does exchange off one of the most important defenders of the white king. It almost certainly exchanges it off, the bishop on g2. A variation like, for example, rook d1, white would allow the attack to get going for black. Bishop takes on g2. Of course, white recaptures, and now the only defender of his king is the bishop on e3. Even that is only playing a peripheral role. Knight g4. And there are some terrible threats like rook takes bishop, and the black queen coming into f2, and a very unpleasant attack indeed. This is what Blackney should have played for. In the event he didn't, he played something else, and after many adventures where both sides missed possibilities, he ended up losing the game, move 51. Having said that though, I still believe his novelty, 12 knight a5, we've shown here, is a very important contribution to opening theory, and is the way the Budapest is to be played in the late 1990s. Well, the other way of responding to the bishop check is knight to d2, after which there is no doubling of the white c-pawns. There's also no retention of the extra pawn, because black's reply queen e7 ensures that the pawn of e5 will be regained. All the same, people do play this way with white in an attempt to get the advantage, hoping to get such features as the bishop pair and or a space advantage in the middle game. The position before you contains one of the most infamous traps in all of opening theory. a3 is a common enough move for white, and we'll just be looking at it. But in reply, black does not have to move his bishop. He can play knight from g4, takes pawn e5. This is called the Kieninga trap, after a gentleman of that name who apparently first deployed it in an offhand game in 1925. Whether that is the true provenance, we don't know, but there have been many other claimants to it, but he was the one who got his name attached to it. The point is, of course, if pawn takes bishop, then knight to d3 is checkmate. So that's to be avoided. Knight takes e5 is one way of avoiding it, but there's still no need to move the bishop at b4, because after knight takes e5 in reply, we have reinstated the same mate threat at d3. Were white now to capture on e5, or black only then gives up his bishop for the knight at d2 with check, then recaptures at e5 with his queen with a totally equal game. So that's not what they do. They tend to play e3. And now your bishop really is en prise. So, take the knight with check. White recaptures. And now black must develop the rest of his pieces. d6 makes a lot of sense. Bishop e2. No other sensible square for that. White wants to hang on to his bishop pair. Castles. Castles. Well, in a sense, that's the end of the opening, but modern ideas of what the opening is go a bit further than old ones. b6. b4. Now the move b4 introduces a recurrent strategical idea. White has the bishop pair, but often he wants to implement a sort of quasi-minority attack on the queen side, involving, if he can, the advance c4 to c5 at some stage to mess up the black pawn structure. That explains the move black now chose in a game from 1991, Los Angeles US Open, Kupka against Yermolinsky. Yermolinsky, not too American a name, but like a lot of the current American team, he was originally from Russia. Rook d8 he played, a prophylactic move, the idea being that if black is faced with the problem of c5, he'll just take it back, this time with his d-pawn, and open up an attack on the white queen. And so long as the white queen is on the same file as the rook, that's going to be a recurrent defensive motif, which explains why white now shifted it to c3. And once again, if bishop b7, it's this c5 problem, which will probably amplify the effect of white's pair of bishops and or weaken the black queenside pawn structure. So Yermolinsky came up with an interesting treatment. he played c5 himself. Now that has the problem of creating a backward pawn on the open d file and permanently weakening the d5 square. Since white has no knight that can land at d5, that isn't so much of a problem. A lot of recent Master and Grandmaster games have seen black having to worry about or take measures against c5 from white or being weakened by it. Here, Yarmolinsky nips the problem in the bud. So white carried on developing, rook f to d1, bishop b7, rook a2, cute way of doubling on the open file, f6, reinforcing the position of the knight, rook from a2 to d2, rook from a8 to c8, completing development. Now this really is the end of the beginning, and it's a very interesting treatment from black to hold things up on the queen's side that way and also super consolidate the position of his knight at e5. Well, in the event, white tried to get play on the queen's side in a different manner, and he played b5, which I don't think is the most accurate, and Yarmolinsky was very alert to what's going on in the position. He went back to a8. After queen b3, he broke out with a6. White took the pawn. It's again not certain that's the best move, probably a3 to a4 would have been mine. And after rook takes a6, black was doing very nicely, thank you. White played queen b1, which again isn't particularly effective. Queen c7, bishop takes knight, only one reply to that, f takes e5. The white pawn structure is now weaker than the black counterparts. White played bishop d3, black played g6. Well, Yarmolinsky was stronger than his opponent, and he actually outmaneuvered him and won the game. But here, I think you'll agree, he has no real problems. So the whole opening experiment, the whole strategical experiment of black reacting to the projected advance c4, c5, or playing c5 himself, was vindicated and remains, I think, a plan which will be further explored. A very similar sort of middle game to the one which occurs after a3 will happen if white plays instead just e3, because sooner or later, naturally enough, black will take the e5 pawn. He'll almost certainly do so now, in fact. Knight takes e5. And white takes it. Black takes back. After bishop e2, we're reaching one of the more common treatments. Czech Grandmaster Pavel Blatný is one of the most noted modern practitioners of the Budapest. A game of his from against Boris Alterman from a tournament in the Czech Republic in 1993 shows many of the themes of this position. Black played b6. White castled. Black of his own volition took on d2. I took back. The fianchetto is complete. There are clear similarities here with some features of the Nimzo-Indian defence, particularly in lines with Queen c2, where white wins the bishop pair but black has play on the long light square diagonal as compensation. Alterman built the game up as follows: rook c1, rook to c1, d6, b4, castle kingside, c5. Once again, this thematic breakthrough, opening up play for the bishops and trying to weaken the queenside pawn structure for black. The way Blatný reacted is quite noteworthy. He took with the d-pawn. White recaptured. And rook to d8, gaining time. Queen c3. And what happens now is noteworthy. First of all, knight g6. Retreating the knight with gain of time. Bishop must retreat, of course. Bishop g3. And then rook d5. Forcing a crisis on the queen's side. If c6, then after bishop c8. Black's not doing so badly. So white took on b6. Black recaptured with the c-pawn. Away from the centre, but necessary here. White played rook to d1. Black doubled on the d-file. Exchange rooks. And the consequences of the opening are not so bad for black. White has a bishop pair. Black has a queenside pawn majority. Position is perhaps slightly favourable for white in the event it was drawn at move 61. And I think it represents some typical themes for the correct handling of the black position. If you can't actually get to play c5 yourself, as Yarmolinsky did in the earlier game, then this way of reacting to white's playing it is one of the most adequate. That then is my preferred treatment of the line with bishop f4. In passing, I should note that there is another subdivision which occurs in this position instead of bishop b4 check, as I recommend. Bishop c5 is another way of doing things. However, I am recommending the treatments with instead bishop to b4 check. I think it's probably the better of the two moves. And to summarise these lines stemming from bishop b4 check, we've seen that when white plays knight c3 and then queen d5, hanging on to his extra pawn, black is able to drum up enough counterplay to justify the gambit. In the other lines with knight d2, where the pawn is returned, by keeping his wits about him, he will maintain equal chances in that very different middle game. For knight f3 is one of the most classical replies. Now, most people play bishop c5 or bishop b4 check in this position, but I'm going to recommend knight c6 instead, which is a slightly less usual line, but a perfectly reputable one. White can do three things, really. Bishop f4, we already know about from the previous discussions. e3 is by far the most usual move here, which we'll be studying at length. Bishop g5, though, is something to be considered as well. Black is virtually obligated to play bishop e7. I will exchange. Black takes with the queen. And after knight c3 we have a familiar scenario of sorts where white is again trying to argue that his possession of the d5 square as an outpost for a knight will give him the advantage. However, in 1986, a game between Lev Polagajski, the late great Sicilian expert, and Dr. John Nunn, showed quite a simple method for black to equalise. He castled. After knight d5, dropped back with the queen to d8. There were some tactical tricks involving an earlier capture of the pawn d5, but by just waiting like this and going back to base, he decides to take the pawn under less dangerous circumstances. e3, now he took it. White exchanged. Black recaptured. Bishop e2, d6. Perhaps a very slight advantage for white in this middle game because of the position of the knight, but nothing too serious. White castled. c6 to get the knight away. Knight c3. Bishop e6 to develop with tempo. b3. Queen a5. And black equalised, even though white eventually exploited some errors by Dr. Nunn later on and won the game in 49 moves. The consequences of the opening are perfectly satisfactory. So that was castling at move 7, not a what you call a red-hot theoretical novelty, but actually quite an important move to show a simple way of equalising against the sideline 5 bishop to g5. So after knight c6, e3. And by far the great majority of master games from here have continued with bishop to c5. Black later, of course, rounding up the e5 pawn. However, I want to consider another possibility, which is based around the idea of kingside fianchetto for black. It's not so often seen, but I think it's probably viable and has the element of surprise behind it. So let's look at taking back immediately with the g4 knight. Well, because it's a relatively surprise weapon, there's not so much theory on it. Here's a game from 1982 between two Dutch grandmasters, Sosonko and Ray. White played bishop e2, black began the fianchetto. Knight c3, knight takes f3 check, bishop takes f3, bishop g7. A reasonable fianchetto type middle game for black, obvious similarities with some lines of the King's Indian. Sosonko, who's normally quite a pacific chap, came up with an ambitious plan. Possible queenside castling. Queen d2, d6, b3. Black decided to attack the bishop on f3 with tempo. And now Sosonko once again, somewhat uncharacteristically, played bishop b2. allowing the capture of his bishop and the doubling of his pawns, for which he gained reasonable play, control of the centre, and play down the g-file. It's worth stopping to think why he didn't play the bishop back, which is rather more in his style, because now we get some really Budapest tactics coming out. Queen g5 is the move. Of course, if f4 doesn't fork a piece because black takes the g-pawn with his queen, winning, attacking the rook in the corner. And this is quite an irritating attack. White can't castle, as he'd like to do, because in reply comes bishop h3, forcing g3 and winning the exchange. If g3, then probably queen f6 is an interesting move, threatening knight f3 check, followed by capture on c3. And if white plays the natural move bishop b2, we have knight f3 check, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop. Black has the bishop pair, and for the time being white can't castle. Castling kingside is rather effectively met by bishop h3. Once again winning. This is the only way to avoid mate is queen d5. Finally there's a move bishop f1, looks a bit ridiculous but does threaten f4, winning a piece. But there is a very alarming reply indeed hidden in the bowels of the position. Bishop to h3. Developing the tempo, and of course that bishop can't be taken because of knight f3 check, forking king and queen. And what is white to do? If f4, the fork, turns out to be no problem, black plays queen h4 check. And white cannot intervene with queen f2 because of knight d3 check, followed by bishop takes c3 check, winning material. The rook in the corner, for example. So, if king d1, white can find himself in a middle game where the strange positioning of his king tells against him. For example, bishop g4 check, king c2 is castled by hand, after does knight c6. Black is a very active and very pleasant position. What does that leave? Well, if we go back to after bishop h3, black is threatening to capture the g-pawn with his bishop. Rook g1 doesn't stop it because of knight f3 check. Pawn takes f3, queen takes g1. Another pin appears, this time on the bishop at f1. One last possibility, I suppose, is knight e4, attacking the queen, but because of the fork at f3, black need not worry about the bishop being taken on h3, just goes back with his queen to e7, and is once again very nicely placed. For example, bishop b2, good castle. How is white to develop his king's wing? Long casting he might try, then the bishop really is on pre, so we can move it away to f5, or even to d7, and carry on with an attack later on with a5, a4, with excellent chances. All those variations resulting from the retreat bishop e2, and it looks as first as though white is just going to push black back with f4, illustrate some of the latent dynamism in the black game. And you've got to play actively really to make the whole thing work. Rather than going back, black carried on going forward with queen g5, bishop h3, and took over the board. So, Sissonko, bearing that in mind, went bishop b2, and we get a very different type of game indeed. Knight takes f3 check, capture, castles kingside, castles the other way. Now bishop h3. Quite a nice move, stopping the advance of the h-pawn, and also incidentally threatening bishop to g2, winning the pawn with f3. So rook g1, only now did he go to e6. Knight to e4, white hopes to get an attack going on the dart squares. f5, very interesting move. Knight comes into g5, exchange off, takes with the queen of course to control the long diagonal, and so too does black counter with queen f6, challenging on that long diagonal. Situation of dynamic equality more or less arose after f4. Black played very astutely, exchanged the queens and dropped back with bishop f7. Now c5 is a very dangerous move to break in with the rooks, but Ray saw he could handle it. Quite a clever man. I played him in Paris the year after this, and we drew quite a complicated game there. He showed some very ingenious defensive chances. Rook d7. Rook d8, a very alert move, giving up the c7 pawn to activate his own rook on the 7th rank should white unwisely go in for that swap. He didn't. He preferred position to material, as Capablanca recommended, and doubled his own rooks. Black exchanged, of course. Now to repulse this knight with h6. Drops back. White's pieces are by far the more dominating, but black is a clear pawn up, don't forget. Rook c8, knight to e5, so white's really achieved about maximum activity here, but it proves to be insufficient to win the game. In fact, black is drawing quite easily. White must take a draw. If he tries to play for more, it does end up being a pawn down. Rook e7, king f8, rook h7, king g8, e7, king f8. They're now repeated with rook h7, king g8. If rook e6, then, for example, rook to d8 is a very good move, threatening rook d6, and the exchange off of the rooks at the same time undoubling the black c-pawns, thereby increasing their value. The only other move after rook e6, and presumably the only point of trying it, is to take the g-pawn with check, but unfortunately black has king f7, winning material through the double attack on rook and knight. Although seen far less frequently in practical play than alternatives involving developing the bishop at c5, it does seem to me that these plans with knight c6 have at least as much practical merit to them. In particular, the idea of the kingside fianchetto, which we've seen more than once in this video, has been, I feel, underestimated by theoreticians. The play on the dart squares which black can develop in these middle games is in many ways highly reminiscent of a King's Indian, or even the Leningrad variation of the Dutch defence. Typically black will be castling short, playing d6. The square e6 is a very natural one for the queen's bishop. He may also use the e-file, and the advance of the a-pawn is another strategical theme. It's very much a counter-attacking system. Well, that concludes our survey of the Budapest defence, or Gambit, as I personally would prefer to call it. I think you'll agree we've seen some excellent and interesting dynamic play for black. I hope it won't be long before you yourselves are doing over your opponents in this style.